Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. We're going to talk today about a book called A Country Called Home, which is a novel by Kim Barnes. It's her second novel. Publisher is Alfred A. Knopf. And I'd like to thank you for coming by.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, this second novel is a book that, at a certain level, begins simply enough. Mm-hmm. It's 1960, and it begins in a kind of 1960s way. A young couple from upper-class neighborhood in Connecticut leave Connecticut to go west and precisely to Fife, Idaho, to live a better life.
Yes. Isn't
that kind of the way it starts?
Yes, it's absolutely the way it starts. The main story, anyway.
It gets a lot more complicated. It gets a lot more complicated. It's a book that, if you describe it that way, you miss so much it's not even funny, because the book has great depth. Claire Davis had some nice things to say about it in that regard. She says, a seductive book of love and obsession, Kim Barnes's new novel explores the consequences of a man's single-minded vision and a family made to walk the knife's edge between control and freedom. It is an elegant work, a lyrical feast. So richly imagined it feels genuinely lived. Some books are easily put down, but the best of them, like A Country Called Home, won't let go of you. Now, we could just keep reading that for the rest of the segment. That would be very, 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 very pleasant. It's not a novel. It's also a novel of place. Mm-hmm. It's a novel of place, I think, in two senses: the land, the weather, and the power of that, and also the simple, direct nature of the people. Mm-hmm. Are you reporting Idaho here?
I imagine that I am. It is my home country. It was where I was born and raised, and where I continue to live by choice.
Aha.
And it is
a native Idahoan.
I am
is that
a
how
native
you say
Idahoan.
That?
Yes.
Idahoan?
Although I don't have a bumper sticker that tells other people to go home.
One of these days. One of these days. But there is this sense of the importance of the land, and indeed, in many places in the novel, you kind of stop and just talk about that and its and its influence. There's the incident of the Great Flood, and people's lives get shaped by this, I guess.
It's absolutely true. The land is a character unto itself in the novel, and two of my main characters, Thomas and Helen Darricott, the young couple who come from Connecticut to Idaho to make a better life for themselves, are actually following the model of Scott and Helen Nearing, who actually started the Back to the Land movement
I see.
In the 60s. And there are a number of people still living in Idaho who came to Idaho in the 60s following that same dream, that it's an Arcadian vision, that they would leave their civilized life, their complicated life, and set out to find this kind of paradise that you could find in nature. And, of course, what many of them found is what Thomas and Helen find, is that it's much more complicated than that.
A lot more complicated, particularly if you buy a piece of land that you've never seen, not even a rendering of, from a real estate agent.
It happened, and it continues to happen.
And how many guys go out there to find this new life who can't drive a nail?
Yeah, or have never held a hammer, which has been the case with Thomas Darricott. He's a little hapless.
By the time you're through with him, I view him as a very well-drawn anti-hero.
Yeah.
It seems as though no matter the situation, he tends to come up short.
Yeah. He's I see him as being possessed of something of a noble but tragic vision.
A noble but tragic vision. Yeah, very, very theoretical.
Well,
Noble.
Yes, but all he wants is to make a better life for himself and for his family. And in that way, he was very much like my own father, who was possessed of the same kind of single-minded vision.
Was it your father who moved to Idaho originally?
It was. His life was dissimilar from Derricott's in many ways. He was raised in a family of poor red dirt Oklahoma sharecroppers. Mm-hmm. And whereas Thomas, is a physician who has been trained at Yale, but their vision is very similar. They, too, were questing for a landscape.
Thomas, as a doctor, though, has one great failing. He doesn't like patience.
Yes.
A Country Called Home takes us inside Fife, Idaho, where we meet some fascinating people. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Kim Barnes is our guest today on Conversations on the Coast. Her new novel is called A Country Called Home. The publisher is Alfred A. Knopf, and a gentleman by the name of Mark Sprague, author of An Unfinished Life, had some great things to say. The country through which Kim Barnes's characters travel in this novel of spiritual and emotional searching, well, that's for sure, is a landscape eroded by grief and yearning and ultimately shame for our dissolution from our gods. I finished reading A Country Called Home some time ago and still cannot quite move on from the experience. I very much agree with that, and I don't know why I can't move on, but the story kind of continues to haunt me. It's not that I'm fixated on the anti-hero or, indeed any of the characters. It's just that it's a story, I think, because it's so real that it kind of stays with you. Mm-hmm. That's my thought. There's a point in the book where we really get to understand, I think, what Helen's problem is. Now, we know already that our friend the doctor is, failed. A failed doctor, I would call him. But our friend Helen has a problem. And it's a problem of loneliness. Mm-hmm. And at one point, you reveal the tears came so unexpectedly that the sob broke from her throat before she could stop it. She rocked faster. How could she have foreseen this kind of loneliness? Those months with Thomas before the move, she'd felt satisfied. Just the two of them with time enough to talk, laugh, and question. He'd broken the back of her boredom, thrilled her with his odd intelligence. There had been something feral about him, exotic, as though he had come to her from some faraway country. Indeed, her mother said, not our kind of people, and that had made it even better. So there you are. But now she's out in the middle of nowhere, and she's lonely. And the main reason she's lonely, I think, is because they don't talk.
Yeah.
They talk very little. Yeah. And his main business is fishing.
That's right. Yeah. The land is enough for him. As long as he has Helen there to share it with him, he can't imagine living without either one of them, and he must have both, but he doesn't realize what Helen needs to be satisfied in this landscape.
In many ways, the character who dominates the story is the young man when he's first introduced, 18, I think, at that point or less. His name is Manny, and we meet him first as what you call the communally adopted son of the women of Fife. What does that mean?
Manny's mother died when he was a boy, and his father abandoned him. And in this very rural, isolated western town, the idea of what you would do with such a child, such an orphan, was simply to take him in. He had no other family. And so he simply stayed with first one family and then another, and was moved from household to household until he was old enough to decide to move out on his own.
And out he went. And he hires out in return for room and board.
With the Derricotts.
To help the doctor establish the farm that he bought sight unseen.
Without walking the lay of the land. The townspeople can't get over it.
And as one might expect, I guess, Manny becomes involved very deeply with the two, with the doctor and his wife. A child is born to them, and at one point you write a scene that is so beautiful about Helen, the child, and Manny. I'd like you to read it. It's so wonderful.
I'd be glad to. Manny held Elise close and breathed in her scent of sweet milk and talcum. He heard the makeshift curtain drawn closed around the corner by the stove where he had set the china wash bowl and a jug of river water to warm. Manny imagined Helen for only a moment before turning his attention back to Elise. The slight weight of her steadied him, and he hummed a low tune, the Tennessee waltz, stepping, sliding. He remembered being balanced atop his father's feet, their graceful dip and swirl around the kitchen. He lifted on his toes, floated forward, and turned to see Helen, her hair damp and undone. She smiled and joined him, her hands on his shoulders, and they continued their dance through the tawny dark, gliding along to the silent music, the child held between them, dreaming on.
That's kind of a picture of domestic bliss, I think. But
not the one that any of them had imagined.
That's the interesting thing, isn't it? That it comes from a quarter you wouldn't expect, probably wouldn't recommend, nonetheless beautiful for all that.
Thank you.
Well, we're running out of time here. We've got one more segment to go, but there's one more character in A Country Called Home we must spend time with. You'll find out when you stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast, A Country Called Home. That's the novel we're talking about. We're talking with the author, Kim Barnes, and a gentleman by the name of Brady Udall, author of The Miracle Life of Edgar Mint. Never heard of that, but sounds
fabulous
like a
book.
Fabulous book. You don't have to compliment him. He's here to compliment you. Kim Barnes's new novel is an exquisitely complex story, by terms pointed and poignant, about everything that matters: family, loyalty, religion, memory, love. With a master's skill, Barnes paints a world tinged with loss, adeptly depicting sentiments left unspoken, relationships stunted by the hard winds of grief and guilt, and singular moments full to brimming with natural beauty and grace, like the one we just read, I think. A Country Called Home is guided by a generous but hard-nosed sensibility and populated with appealingly flawed characters. I love that phrase, appealingly flawed, aren't we all? Appealingly flawed characters whose hopes, desires, and self-contradictions are our own. That's the way we are. It's called the human condition, I guess. I don't know.
Indeed.
One aspect of religion that comes up in this book in a very forceful manner, I think, is Elise's finding God and winding up with a dual diagnosis. Tell us about that.
Well, Elise is a young woman coming into her young womanhood, finds that the isolation she has grown up in is no longer enough for her. For a while, she had been satisfied with her horse and with this landscape that was so familiar to her. And
satisfied with Manny.
With Manny, who
was actually raising her.
He is.
Homeschooling her.
In the absence of her mother and in the emotional absence of her father, it is Manny who steps in to fill that void. And all is going well for quite a while. But then the solitude she had known turns to isolation, and she starts wanting other companions, wanting friends, wanting a boyfriend. And
she's kind of mirroring her mother.
She is. She is the product of both her father's need to control her mother and her mother's appetite for the world. And this manifests itself in a particular way, one of which is that she's a synesthete, which means that she has a condition known as synesthesia, so that when she hears music, she sees color. So when she attaches herself to a local fundamentalist church, because that is the family she has never known. They call one another brother and sister. And they become a community that will take her in and accept her. But because I was raised in just such a church, I know that anything such as synesthesia would be considered a vision and not a good one. And the church goes about...
A vision that would come from the devil.
Yes, it would not be a vision from God. And the church convinces Elise that she is demon-possessed.
Now, but she winds up in an institution, and that's one of the diagnoses.
Yes.
And the other one is anorexia.
Yeah, well, the church convinces her that she must fast and pray to rid herself of this demon. And the fasting becomes a kind of self-denial that I think we recognize in perhaps a lot of young women who are lost to any sense of their value in themselves. And so...
And there's even a hint, I think, in your novel. Before she gets involved with the church, she's becoming displeased
with her body. Yeah, she's growing into her woman's body, and she has no way to make sense of that. She has no mother. It is Manny who is overseeing her into her womanhood, and she has no context. She is so isolated.
You know, it just dawned on me, one of the most remarkable things about your book, and I'm going to bring it a note. I don't like to give away stuff,
okay.
But
spoiler.
let me just say that incredibly, Elise turns things around.
She does.
While in this, if you will, mental institution. I've never heard of that before. and pretty much on her own. I mean, the people who are counseling her in there are, not doing a heck of a lot. No.
Elise is possessed of a self-awareness that has probably been given to her by Manny. She becomes confused and misdirected for a while, but that sense of self that has been instilled in her by Manny, she is reminded of that. And there is a lot of conflict and some dark things that happen in this book. But in my mind, it's a very happy ending. It's a story of rebirth and regeneration and how one generation can make up for the flaws of the other.
That happy ending is your opinion. Those people out there are going to have to buy the book. Go out and buy it right now and see if you agree. A Country Called Home. Kim Barnes is the author. This is Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.